I still have to. I've still not moved it. I will make sure I move it today when I go in. So this will be in your notes. Okay, by the end of today, this will be in your notes. In the meantime, you can just stick to the videos. And this is too big. Maybe we should not even make it 115. Is the font big enough, Shubham? Last bench? You can read. Okay. You can't read. Your eyes are what? So what? How can you not read on the first bench? Then you have a problem with your eyes.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
If Shubham and Kamya can read on the last bench, do you wear glasses? So then you better get your eyes checked.
Yeah.
How long have you been having this problem?
So,
So you better go and don't play with your eyes. Go and get your eyes checked quickly. If you can't see this kind of stuff, that means you have some problem with your eyes. You better go and get it checked. Okay? Don't worry, that's okay. For the moment, you just listen to me. For this class, we can't fix it right now. But you go and get your eyes checked quickly. Get an appointment and get your eyes checked quickly. You should not be having this problem. Is not normal. That means there's something wrong with your eyes. With your eye, you need to have your eyes checked. Go quickly and go and see an ophthalmologist. Don't just go to a optometrist or whatever it is. I think the guys who decide who make the glasses. Go and see a eye doctor, proper ophthalmologist. Okay, go and see a specialist. All right. I think what we finished yesterday, guys. Where we finished up yesterday was. Please make sure nobody is to distract me in any way. Okay, you will lose marks. Okay, so we finished consideration. We finished the discussion of consideration. We finished genus and species. We covered all that, right? And we covered neutum pactum. We talked about this kind of language. Get used to this kind of language because this can be used in every kind of subject. Marketing, operations, HR, everywhere. All this kind of genus species concept that all contracts are agreements, but all agreements are not contracts. It's just like saying that all BCA students are students, but all students are not BCA students, right? So this kind of language, this kind of concept, get used to it because these are all new ways of thinking for most of you. So it doesn't get permanently embedded in your bar. Objective in learning is always to make sure that whatever is covered is permanently embedded in your brain. If you learn it conceptually rather than mugging it up, it will be permanently embedded in your brain. You have to learn it conceptually. And our goal is we are not concerned with syllabus coverage. We are not obsessed with syllabus coverage. The objective of the class is that you're here to ask questions. As many questions as you have from as many angles on a particular topic. Ask your questions and clarify. The objective is always be clear about the joint objective of the class and the teacher. The objective is to make sure that whatever is covered is permanently embedded in your brain. That is the objective. Okay, so that's how we should be studying. Okay, so this kind of thinking, be clear about. Now we'll go on to the differences between certain types of contracts and agreements. Okay, so we are going to cover these elements. Contract, so these are certain definitions: contract, void agreement, voidable contract, and contract which becomes void. Okay, so what I've done, so once again, let's go back to the schema that I have here. This of course is not there in the Contract Act or anything. I've just created it to help you to understand it. So we can see that here all agreements are split up into contracts and void agreements. All right, and so under contract, so what we say here, because we are going to come up with some further definitions, voidable contracts, which we haven't covered, the definition of which we haven't covered. So further what we are showing here is that when you look at the universe of contracts, they can be further split up into voidable contracts, and this term is not there in the Indian Contract Act, but I have coined it just to distinguish with the other category, distinguish between this and the other category. Remember, one of the second rules of taxonomy, I've made some changes yesterday, I covered it with you guys. So the second rule is that, one is principle 0, which I added, which is that the taxa has to be comprehensive. No, that is principle 5, okay, that you're consuming. That the numbering of the principle doesn't matter so much, but it's the principle itself, that the content of the principle that matters. But here what we are combining is the first principle, that is that the taxonomy has to be comprehensive. So we have divided all contracts into voidable contracts and non-voidable contracts. So that's a correct classification, because in fact you can classify all contracts into these two categories, okay. And non-voidable, just remember, is not a contract law term, but I've just coined it to distinguish between voidable contracts and the other types of contracts which are not voidable contracts. That's why, okay. So remember, this is the second rule, which is that taxa have to be voidable and non-voidable, mutually exclusive, okay. So the second rule we are applying also here, that taxa have to be mutually exclusive. So I've therefore there I'm able to, using that principle, I'm able to create a second category which is non-voidable. So whatever does not fall in this box must be a non-voidable contract, because they can't fall in both boxes, right? Mutually exclusive rule. So this is the taxonomy that I've created here to help you to understand. So we're going to have this discussion on voidable contracts, so, and also looking at what is a contract that becomes void. So let's understand the definitions. So what I've done is just to understand this these things. Is it still visible on the last bench, Raghav? You can see? You can't see now. It's, yeah, because I made that 80%. So let's go back to, is it better now? I think the gray background, this is my personal preference. I like to put a gray background because I find the white background is it's too bright for reading on a computer. So I make everything like a gray background. But I've just made it lighter gray. Is it better now? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So differences. So what I've done is to help you to understand these differences better. I put in an additional element here, which is that we define in the Contract Act. A contract is defined an agreement enforceable by law. Okay, it is not clear about whether it's enforceable against both parties or against only one party. It doesn't spell it out expressly, but also understand the language, the usage of the language. In general, if it says a contract is an agreement enforceable by law, then in general, without any further statement, it is to be understood as meaning that it is enforceable against all parties to the contract. Are you following what I'm saying? If there is no discussion of whether it is enforceable against one party only or two party or both the parties, or so generally there are only two parties, but you can have multiple parties to a contract also. You can have that possibility. So the point is that if we just say a contract is an agreement enforceable by law, and we don't make a mention of whether it's enforceable against one person or another person or both the parties, then it is to be understood as implying that it is enforceable against everyone who is a party to the contract. Okay, so that's why what I have done, this part in brackets is my language. I have just added it to make sure that your understanding is clear, and because also we want to be able to, we also want to be able to make a distinction between a contract, a simple contract in simple terms, and a voidable contract. Okay, so therefore to make that distinction, I'm clarifying that this definition means that it is enforceable against both parties, a contract. Okay, so now you've seen the first level classification, which we have already covered, that you can have agreements split up. Agreements are either going to be contracts or they're going to be void agreements. Okay, now then under contracts we have a further split. We have split contracts into voidable contracts and non-voidable contracts. So let's look at what is a voidable contract. Okay, so here you already know void agreement. Okay, agreement is already one which is not enforceable. Okay, again I've given a clarification. This is not in the Contract Act definition. Not enforceable by, think of a void agreement as the diametric opposite of a contract. Okay, void agreement is a diametric opposite of a contract. Now that we have clearly defined a contract as enforceable against both parties, okay, and a void agreement is not enforceable, and I've given you a further clarification in the definition. It is not enforceable against either party. Is this clear? A void agreement is not enforceable against either party, and a contract is enforceable against both parties. Is this clear? Okay, so can you see therefore that these are direct opposites of each other, because a contract can be enforced against both parties and a void agreement is not enforceable against either party. This is clear. So therefore total opposites of each other. Okay, now why did we need that definition? Why did we need that contract definition enforceable against both parties? Because we are going to create a further, so void agreement not enforceable against either party. We'll come back to this void ab initio part later. Okay, now we talk about a voidable contract. Okay, a voidable contract, which is basically an agreement which is enforceable by law at the option of one. But not at the option of the other. So now you can see how we have created a very clear technical distinction between. See, what did we say a contract is? See how these categories and subcategories work. What did we say a contract is? It's an agreement enforceable against both parties. Okay, we will not bother with saying enforceable by law because that's understood. Okay, so a contract is enforceable against both parties. Okay, and then we create a further subcategory of contracts as a kind of an exception to the rule of contract. We now create a further subcategory where we say, well, there are some contracts which are voidable, which means they are not enforceable against both parties. Okay, there's actually a slight problem with this classification, but I'll only teach you what is in the Contract Act. I'm not going to teach you the critique because that's a second stage of inquiry. Okay, so initially let's understand the classification given in the Contract Act. So you have a subcategory of contracts which is almost like an exception to that, because we said this is enforceable against both parties, and now we create a further subcategory of voidable contract which is enforceable at the option of one party but not at the option of the other party. Okay, here we are assuming there are only two parties to the contract. Is this clear? Are you following what we are trying to say here? That it is enforceable against one party but not enforceable against the other party. So we are making a distinction against contracts. Okay, so it's almost, although it's treated as a subcategory by the terminology, right, but it is actually almost like an exception to contracts because contracts are enforceable against both. So you have a voidable contract which is actually enforceable, and let me give you an example here to make you understand it. Okay, so this is actually a real case that went all the way out into the Supreme Court, where a girl was she got married to someone, and then she was told that obviously this is a young man, but later on she discovered this was actually a very old man, so she could not make out during the wedding because everything is covered. So now this is a case of a wedding. Now if you treat marriage as also like a contract, okay, although under Hindu law and Christian law we say that marriage is a sacrament. Under Hindu law we say it's a sacrament, which means it can never be broken. That's why even Catholics, you can't get a divorce. If you're the strict Catholic Church does not recognize divorce because they treat marriage as a sacrament, which means once you're bound forever. Okay, so similarly under traditional Hindu law it was treated as a sacrament, but now the courts have become more liberal. So but the point is, but it is also a marriage is also a contract where both parties have very much like a contract where both parties, if you look at Muslim law, in Muslim law the treatment of marriage as a contract is much more explicit. In Muslim law, marriage is actually treated like a contract. Okay, so it's a clearer treatment of the marriage as a contract. So now the point is that in this case what has happened is, if you treat marriage as a contract, in this case the girl's consent to the marriage, she agreed to the marriage because she thought that the groom was a young man, right? But then later on she discovered that she had been fooled. The groom was actually an old man. So in this case what has happened is, we'll see this later on further when we look at consent and how section 10, what are the 5 filters that you have to pass through. But the point here is that in this case and we also have not covered that point that Vipul was raising the other day, that is about consent. Okay, agreement has to involve consent from both parties, right? So the point here is that her consent, she agreed to the marriage because she thought that the husband was a young man, but in fact she was fooled. So her consent was vitiated her consent was not really free and pure because it was vitiated by fraud and misrepresentation. Okay, she was fooled, she was given wrong information, so misrepresentation and fraud was committed on her. So in this case what we will say is this is an example of a contract which is voidable. Okay, it is voidable, enforceable by law at the option of one but not at the option of the other. So in this example what will happen is that the girl has the option. Okay, it is enforceable by law at the option of one. For this example, this one is the girl. Okay, the girl, if she chooses, she can still make this contract work, and she can still hold the husband accountable and make him perform all the duties of a husband. Okay, she can do that. So there is one-sided power in avoidable agreement. She can force the husband to perform all his duties under the marriage contract, but the husband cannot force her to do that. So it doesn't work the other way, because it's a voidable contract, but the husband, this other in this case is the husband. It is not enforceable at the option of the husband, because the consent of the person, of the girl, was obtained by fraud and misrepresentation. The husband cannot enforce this marriage contract against the girl. So he cannot make her perform all the duties of a wife, okay, but she can make him perform all the duties of a husband. Do you understand? This is an example of a voidable contract, wherever there are certain circumstances where a contract becomes voidable. Okay, so this is basically an example. This is what is meant by a voidable contract, where there is some kind of problem in the formation of the contract, right, where it is vitiated, where the consent is vitiated by fraud, coercion. So if I hold a gun to somebody's head and force him to sign a contract agreeing to sell his property to me, okay, so he has agreed to sell his property to me, has signed the document to sell his property to me, but if I take this document to court and then force him to sell the property to me, try to get the court to force him, then he will say before the court that I signed it, but he was holding a gun to my head when I had to sign it. So therefore so that is an example of coercion. So all these are cases where the consent of the party is being vitiated. It is not a pure and free consent. Okay, there is some kind of, either I'm giving him wrong information, or some other kind of fraud is being committed, or there is coercion. Okay, so I tell him that if you don't do this, I'll beat up your son, or something like that. Some kind of threat is being made. So some kind of coercion is involved. So the consent is not free. Are you following what is meant by lack of free consent? Yeah? Yeah. Okay, I'm wondering why I'm shouting so much, because I didn't even put this back. Yeah.
Contract, you can say that the other person is not, he cannot break the contract, but the girl can break the contract.
That's right. That's exactly right. So it is not enforceable at the option of the other. So you have understood it exactly correctly. So he cannot break the contract, and he cannot make her perform the obligations under the contract. Okay, there is not enforceable at the option of the one, which is the girl, right? So that's exactly it, basically, right? So she can make him do all the things that a husband is supposed to do, but he cannot force her to remain married to him. Okay, so is this first point clear? Contract and a voidable contract set up as a subcategory of contract. Okay, because why am I saying, see, why have I done this? Why have I put voidable contracts under contracts? Because of the language of the Contract Act. The moment you say voidable contract, okay, it's like, say, if I say LLB student, that means there is no getting away from the fact that an LLB student is also a student. Okay, he's a subcategory of student. So because of the language, so I'm forcing the legislature to stick to the language that they have used in the Contract Act. So therefore, by that rule, I'm putting it as a subcategory of contract, although it is kind of like an exception to the contract rule, because the contract is enforceable against both parties. Now you have set up, so there's a slight problem with this definition and this classification. So, but we are not going to get into that. Let's just learn the act as it is written and as it is understood by everybody, because nobody else has raised this question. But as you will see, if you think about it, there is actually a slight problem here. Okay, yeah.
You can also see this these contracts which are made by fraud or something like that. So it can be voidable.
It can be?
Voidable.
Yeah, they are voidable contracts. That's what I just gave you an example of a voidable contract. So it is this example of a contract. The contract is voidable at the option of the girl, okay, who was the victim of the fraud or misrepresentation.
In that case, the legally is correct, because the contract has been made, but it was not like the consent of both. It was impersonated or fraud. But since it's a contract, so now it's voidable.
Yeah, but the reason I raised the objection, this is a slightly technical debate, but the reason I raised the objection is, how have we defined contracts Remember, because we are also making a distinction between contract and void agreement. And what are we saying? Now, in the case of contracts, we are saying contracts is enforceable against both parties.
That's what we said.
Yeah. So now if you say that contract is enforceable against both parties, then if you have a subcategory called voidable contract, that is a problem, because it actually should have been called voidable agreement, because it's not really a contract, because you have said that a contract is enforceable against both parties. Okay, the implicit meaning of writing the language like the way it's written in the Contract Act is that it is enforceable against both parties, because you have not qualified the definition. Remember, the definition in the Contract Act of a contract is this: agreement enforceable by law.
Then why we are not saying voidable agreement?
According to me, we should say voidable agreement, but that is not how the Contract Act is written. I'm also reluctant to bring up this controversy before you guys, because I don't want to confuse you people. I want to make sure that you first understand, because if you go, nobody else has raised this question. Okay, but I'm raising this question, and you can see I'm explaining to you what is my thinking and why I have raised this question. As you can see, you are agreeing with my thinking. Okay, but I don't want to confuse people, but it's just, okay, you can just take note of this observation, that's all. It will help you to understand. What it will help you to do is that it will help you to understand a few things, which is how do you interpret language. Okay, so the general rule of interpretation is there is no controversy about this. This is not just about my opinion. Okay, the general rule of interpretation is this: that if you don't qualify a statement, then it applies to all situations. So if you say agreement is enforceable, a contract is an agreement enforceable by law, then it is understood that what you imply is that it is enforceable by law against every party to the contract. Because you have not talked about that point, right? That means it is understood that it applies to the maximum extent possible. This is the way you interpret language. There is no controversy about this. This is not just my opinion. So I have held the legislature to the strict rules of interpretation and taxonomy. Okay, so I have said that therefore if this is the kind of interpretation that we should give, which is the only way to interpret this, therefore it must mean that contracts are enforceable against both parties. So therefore it's logically problematic to say voidable contract, because now you're saying it's like as if an LLB student is in some sense not a student. Okay, you're saying, but that cannot, then you can't call him an LLB student, you have to call him something else. Okay, so the moment you call him an LLB student means automatically he must have all the properties of a student. Are you following what we are saying? Okay, we have to cut some marks for Vratika. I think she is getting a little restless, moving around, scoring some runs. You're having cold. You don't say I'm suffering from a cold. What is the problem? You want to go home? Okay, so if you can't concentrate, just sleep. Okay, but you're not sleeping, you're moving around. Okay, remember, discipline is everything. You need to just remember one word in life, and that is discipline. Okay, so try to discipline yourself. Okay, and if you're feeling unwell, you can always go home. Okay, so I've given Vatsal also the option of going home. Okay, right, where were we? Agreement. Okay, so I hope please be very attentive here. I hope I'm not confusing people. Okay, so let's understand first the language of the Contract Act, and then I think it's okay to have this discussion, okay, about the critique that I'm presenting on the taxonomy and the language. So it will help you to understand better how you interpret language and what are the rules of taxonomy and what is good, strict, logical taxonomy. Okay, so what we are saying here is that contract, the way it has been written in the Contract Act, it has to mean that a contract is enforceable against both parties. Okay, and then what the Contract Act, what the legislature has done is they have defined a term called voidable contract. Okay, this I'm not cooking it up, it's there in the Contract Act, you can see. Okay, somewhere here there will be a, yeah, you can see the last one, I. We can make it a little bit smaller. Can you still see it on the last bench? Come here. Okay, I. Can you see I? Okay. An agreement which is enforceable here is a voidable contract. Okay, and if you see here, agreement enforceable by law is a contract, this automatically means enforceable against both parties. Now the moment you call something a voidable contract, it's like calling somebody a BCA student. That means he must have all the properties of students. Okay, plus he must have some additional properties which make him out to be a BCA student as opposed to an MCA student or LLB students. He must have some other distinguishing properties which are only found in BCA students. Are you following by what I'm saying? Okay, these rules are very important to understand because it will help you to do classification later on in unstructured situations which you are required to do as a business student. So the moment you are using a term like voidable contract, then we are saying that this is a species of contract. A voidable contract is a species of contract. This is problematic definition because if it is a species of contract, it must have all the properties of a contract plus some other types of properties. But in this case, we are saying we are already detracting from one of the properties that we are saying it's not enforceable against both parties. It's enforceable against only one party. So that's why the taxonomy is problematic. Has everyone understood what I'm saying? Everyone has understood what my critique is? Okay, but then nobody else has raised this anywhere in the world. Nobody has raised this question. So let's forget about it. But I still thought it was okay to discuss it with you because now you understand how to analyze and critique something. Okay, but you may or may not agree with my critique, but at least you'll understand why I'm saying what I'm saying. Okay, so then you can think about that. But it will also teach you how to think because that's why we are here. Remember, we are not here to give you information. So generally, even in your finance courses, when there is some material which is just information, you also need to have information in your brain, right? Like what kind of contracts are listed in which exchange in India. But this is just information. So I'm not going to waste my class time teaching you information that here West Bengal capital is Calcutta, this that. So I'm going to just tell you this information is available on this page. Go and read it. Okay, that is your job to read it. So in this class, we are in the class. Our objective is to basically teach you how to think. That's why you come to an MBA program. We are here to learn certain conceptual frameworks and learn how to practice applying them to real life situations and basically teach you how to think. That's what we are here for. So this will help you in that with respect to that goal. All right. Okay. So we go back. Let's go back to the definition of the Contract Act. They have essentially created a subcategory of a voidable contract which is enforceable against only one party. Is everyone clear now? So far? Okay. We must have the rooster alarm ready. Okay. So okay. So voidable contract. This is big enough or what? Font is okay. Raghav. You checked and said it, or you just said it like that? Okay. Okay. You can read. Okay. So we have now understood the difference. Now, have you understood what is a voidable agreement? Where did I write voidable agreement? A voidable contract. Has everyone understood voidable contract now? I gave you two examples. Girl is married off to somebody, then she later on finds the person is an old man. Okay, so she has been the victim of fraud and misrepresentation. So the contract of marriage is voidable at her option. But remember, voidable does not mean that she has to render it void. Okay, so let's understand one thing with respect to this girl. Okay, it's a voidable contract. Now, two things can happen in a voidable contract. Now, she has the right, since it's a voidable contract, she has the right to go to court and ask the judge to annul the marriage and render the marriage void because it's a voidable contract. Okay, and she is the victim of fraud and misrepresentation. She can go to the judge and the marriage is annulled only when the judge passes a decree of annulment saying this marriage is declared annulled. Okay, because it was a voidable contract. Now, but she is not obligated to do that. She has the option to remain married to this old man and demand that he perform all the duties of a husband. Is this clear? So just because, yeah.
So is the example you're trying to see that it is an avoidable contract?
It's the word that we use is voidable. It is voidable at the option of the girl. You can also say, in layman's terms, you can also say it's avoidable. She can avoid her responsibilities on the contract, but you have to be clear because remember, you're an MBA student, you have to be clear that you have to use technical terminology. Okay, so the technical terminology is not avoidable, it's voidable.
Just for the case of a
Yeah. For your understanding, you can understand it as she can avoid her responsibilities under the contract, but she has to go to a court and get it annulled. Okay, yeah. So for your understanding, it's fine, but you have to also be conscious that the technical term is voidable. Okay. So voidable contract. Okay, is everyone clear? But voidable does not mean that she cannot perform the contract. She has a choice. She can exercise the option to render the contract void, or she can decide to perform the contract, remain married to this person. Is this clear to everyone? Yeah. Okay. So that's why I said that in a voidable contract there are two options. What I've listed out here, there are two options. One is either you go to the court and get the contract declared void. In this case, the contract is rendered void. Otherwise, she can decide to perform the contract. It's the same with somebody else. I forced this guy to sign a contract to sell me his house at a very below market rate by holding a gun to his head. But therefore he has the choice of going to the court when I try to enforce the agreement. He has the choice of going to the court and saying that I only signed it because he was holding a gun to my head. But this same guy also has the option of actually selling me the house. He does not have to necessarily go and do that to the court. He has the option. So he can decide still to nevertheless sell me the house. This is clear? Even though the contract is voidable at his option, but he can decide to still perform the contract. Is that clear? Voidable contract and void agreement we have understood. Everyone is clear now so far? Okay. Ashita, are you following? You are trying to set up some communication channels with Sahil. Okay. Okay. Alright, okay, so please pay attention. Now we got a new kind of contract to look at. Contract which becomes void. Where does it stand on the tree? This kind of branch, this kind of a diagram which I've made. So a contract which becomes void is basically a subcategory of this. Okay, so under contracts you have voidable contracts and you have non-voidable contracts, that is those which are not in this box. Okay, now out of the contracts which are not in this box, there is a possibility that the contract can become void. Okay, this is perfectly legitimate contract to start with, but it can become void. So you have to ask this question: does the contract become void? We are trying to understand a new subcategory called contract which becomes void. Okay, what is an example of that? I'll just give you an example. So then, of course, if the contract becomes void and the answer is yes, then it will just become it's void. It becomes void. Okay, and then if it doesn't become void, then it will either be performed or it will be breached. So let's understand what is meant by a contract which becomes void. Okay, so I'll just give you one example. So we do use this in the other class also. And let's go back to 90. All right, so let's say that Ronaldo signs a new contract. Okay, so Ronaldo signs a new contract with the club, and let's say that contract is for 5 years. Okay, and then after 1 year there's some kind of accident and he loses both his legs. Okay, so then what happens is we have this we are now once again a technical term. We use this expression, impossibility of performance. Now, can Ronaldo, why is he being hired? He's not being hired to cook. He's not being hired as a cook, right? He's being hired as a football player. So can he play? Can he perform the contract for the remaining 4 years? He can't. Okay. If he were a pianist, he could have done it. He could have sat in a wheelchair and played the piano with his hands, because only the legs are lost. Okay, but now that because he's a football player, now we have what we call impossibility of performance. He has been hired to play football for 5 years. Now he can't play football anymore. So in this case, we say the contract becomes void. Okay, so it was a perfectly fine and legitimate contract. It was not even a voidable contract or anything like that. Everything was fine, but because something happens, the circumstances are such that it is impossible for one party to perform the contract. So the club can no longer insist that Ronaldo should play football for the next 4 years, and they will of course not insist also. But the point is that this is what is meant by impossibility of performance. Okay, so and when you have impossibility of performance, that's one of the situations where a contract becomes void. Okay, so now it has become void. Now it is not enforceable. Okay, and so essentially what will happen is that what was I going to say? Yeah, so the club cannot insist that he perform the contract. Okay, so another
Suppose there is a contract between two international bodies, and they are going to shipment from India to America, and meanwhile the ship.
Quiet here. Why am I hearing sounds? Yeah.
And meanwhile the ship sunk.
Yeah.
Then it's a voidable contract.
So then, no, it's not a voidable contract.
Contract is void now.
Yeah, in this case it's again void because you have these are called force majeure clauses. These are called force majeure clauses in contracts. When you draft contracts, these are basically what we call acts of God. So these will all be anyway provided in the contract. That in this case there will be insurance and all these kinds of cases. So in this example, there will typically be insurance when there is a shipment. Okay, so essentially what will happen is you will have to, if there is any previous payment payment, you will have to make them whole, you have to return the money, but they cannot be held to you cannot sue them. Suppose it was supposed to reach America in 30 days. Okay, suppose the shipment was supposed to reach America in 30 days, and otherwise there was a provision that you could sue them for breach. Okay, but if the ship sinks halfway through, then you can't sue them for not delivering in 30 days, because there was an impossibility of performance here. So on those terms, the contract will be void. Okay, will become void. Okay, is this clear so far to everyone? Impossibility of performance. So you have another case where, let's say, if I agree to sell my, there's a trade in race horses. If I agree to sell my race horse to Jakar, then what happens after, let's say, the agreement is supposed to be finalized after, say, 3 months. We agree to sell, okay, but we'll execute the contract after 3 months. But then after 1 month, my horse dies. And remember, race horses are very specific. You can't just substitute one horse for the other. So he insists that the same horse has to be sold. Then obviously it can't be, that contract can't be performed, right? So he cannot go to the court and insist that I deliver that same horse, right? Is this clear? So this is another example of impossibility of performance. Okay. So I've already warned you on this before. Void contract should never be used. Expression void contract should always say void agreement. Okay. So all these things which we already discussed is all written here in your notes. I will move it into your folder. I've been saying this for a couple of days, but I will definitely move it today. So you'll have the opportunity to study all this. So all this stuff is, we've already discussed all this point. Now let's understand one more expression, void ab initio. Okay. So one of the things you should be clear about, distinction, void agreement and a contract which becomes void. Okay, what is the distinction between a void agreement and a contract which becomes void? If we go back to this, yeah, a void agreement and a contract which becomes void, if we make it even smaller, helping you to see the categories. So here, okay, so you can see here, you have a void agreement on the one hand, and then you have a contract which becomes void, which is basically here, let's say, in this box. Okay, void agreement and a contract which becomes void. Anybody wants to hazard a guess on what is the difference? Yes, 1 minute. Quiet, please. I'm hearing sounds from here. Yeah.
When agreements are void, it is before the contract. It happens before it turns into a contract.
No. What did you just say? You said that when the agreements are void, it turns into a contract. So this is something else. I'm just using Tarun as an example, so don't take it personally. So, and I'll do this on many occasions. I will take an example with something that somebody is doing. It is meant as a lesson for the whole class. So another thing that you have to practice doing is, remember, your MBA students, your communication has to be top notch. Okay, people expect that from you. So another thing that you must practice is, whenever you're saying something, a part of your brain has to be listening to what you're saying. Okay, nobody is perfect, we're all humans, so sometimes the wrong word will come out of it. You see, sometimes I also say, sometimes maybe when I want to say agreement, I end up saying contract or something like that. But then you have to be listening to what you're saying. A part of your brain has to be monitoring what's coming out of your mouth, so that later on you can just quickly correct yourself. Okay, so in this case, what you ended up saying is what I summarized. Okay, now go again, start again.
So agreements are void means before it turns into a contract, it voids. In the starting,
it becomes void. It is void. Yeah.
In the starting phase, it gets void.
Okay.
And in the contracts becoming void, when the agreement turns into a contract, then after that the parties came to know that something is wrong. After that, the contract gets void.
Okay, so Tarun his expression can be improved. You need to work on improving your expression, but he has understood the concept. We can see clearly. This is what I'm saying in the exam. Also, I will not penalize you for any kind of expression problems. Okay, so if I can see from your writing that you have understood the concept, so don't try to memorize. Just try to write. I will not penalize anybody for bad English or poor expression, but I can see clearly from what he's saying that he has understood the essence of the difference. Okay, now he has not used a big Latin term like ab initio. Ab initio means from the beginning. Okay, so what he has said essentially is that a void agreement is void from the start. It has all this stuff is all written in your notes, so there's no need to write, but make sure you understand, okay? A void agreement, this is what Tarun has basically explained to us, that a void agreement is void from the very beginning. It never has any existence in the eyes of law. Okay, that is what is a void agreement. It's got no existence in the eyes of law ever. So it's like if you do go into a marriage where you don't perform the 7 feras, you don't go 7 times around the fire, it is actually void. This marriage has no validity ever in the eyes of law. Okay, so therefore this marriage had no validity ever to start with. But there's another kind of contract which he's pointing out. In the case of a contract which becomes void, that is, you ask this question, it's not even a voidable contract, then you ask this question and the answer to this question is yes, because of some event happening, the contract becomes void. So so the real difference here is that in the case of a void agreement, at no point of time is the agreement enforceable by law. In the case of a void agreement, okay, it is always not enforceable from the very beginning, okay? But in the case of a contract which becomes void, here, in this case, there is a period of time generally, like in the example that we gave with Ronaldo, for 1 year the contract was a perfectly valid contract, right? It was enforceable against both parties. But then some accident happens and some event happens which renders the contract void. So the real difference between the two, contract which becomes void and a void agreement, is that in this case, at no point of time is the does the agreement have any validity in the eyes of law. Whereas in this case, it does have some validity in the eyes of law for a period of time until that critical event happens when the contract becomes void. Is that clear to everyone? You understood the difference? So this is how you understand concepts, okay? You zero in on the essence of the difference, and once you understand it like this, you'll never forget. I can assure you, you'll never forget. Once you have understood it like this and revised it a couple of times, you'll be very, very clear. You don't even have to study for the exams. Everything will be 100% clear. And okay, so this point is clear to everyone now. So all these things we have already covered. Okay, good. We are making good progress in section B. We are moving quite fast. I hope it's not because people are too shy to ask questions. There are some people we can see who are not shy about asking questions, but we want everybody else to be like that. You should be free to ask questions, and you should ask a lot of questions. So in section A we get a lot of questions. So anyway, okay, so contract which becomes void, that we have seen as well. Okay, what it is. Now we move on to general principles of contracts. Okay, consensus. This is really small. Okay, so general principles of contracts, let's look at this. We are already at 100% Zoom. So, okay. So, the idea here, this Vipul was bringing up this idea in the previous class that, okay, this act is a small a. Okay. Alright. So, the idea here is, understand this, 1 minute. This is again a Latin term. Again, you have to be very comfortable with Latin terms, because as a business student, this is some part of the knowledge or the comfort level you need to have. So don't just get scared by them, just get used to them. Okay. Now, consensus ad idem means only the meeting of the minds. Okay, remember a contract, these are some general principles, just trying to understand them. Once you get the hang of it, you'll be able to understand, you'll be able to even, decide which way a dispute should be decided. Okay, you'll be able to, figure that out. That is, once you understand the basic. So in a contract, we are talking about essentially a meeting of the minds. That is, two parties agree to a contract, okay, to the terms of a contract, right? So therefore, they must agree to the same thing. Okay, they must agree to the same thing, obviously, otherwise what is the point of agreement, right? So if we look at this has already been covered here. We have already encountered this definition, right? In the case of a proposal. Okay, so what is he saying? He's saying that I am willing to do or abstain from doing. And why am I saying this? Because I want you to agree to this. You understand this assent? This is essentially like consent. That means I'm consent. That means I'm agreeing to it. So whatever one party agrees to do under the contract, this is because contracts are formed as a result of negotiation, right? So what they do, so what parties are agreeing to eventually in the contract is, one party is saying, okay, if I do this, will you do this? Okay, so so on and so forth. Then they go back and forth, and eventually they come. So this is the idea that eventually they must agree to the same thing, right? That's all it is. And so this we have discussed already that Under the law, act includes omission. That is failure to do an act. Omission is to be said. Okay. This is what it is. Okay. Consensus ad idem is. So I've given these stars here to help you understand. Agreement on all the details of the contract. Okay. All the parties understand, have accepted the contractual commitments made by each other. Okay. So now we see section 13. This is basically what it is. Understand. Here we look at section 13 of the contract. I've extracted the of the language of section 13. Let's look at it here also. See if we can find section 13 quickly. Yeah. Remember, consent is very important in contracts because we give a lot of importance, a lot of sanctity to what the people have agreed to. So we make sure that they consent. That's why whenever there is any vitiation of consent, because there's coercion or fraud or misrepresentation, then immediately we will say that the contract is voidable. Okay, because the consent must be free. We want to agree, but what we are talking about, what is free? When we talk about consent itself, we have to agree upon the same thing in the same sense. Okay, that is exactly a meeting of the minds. That's why I discussed this term. This is not there in the Contract Act, but you should be familiar with this legal term, a Latin term. Consensus, you understand? You are familiar with the word consensus, right? Okay, everybody agrees. Okay, so consensus ad idem means essentially the consensus meeting of the minds. All right, agreeing to the same thing. This is pretty obvious. Okay, that what this essentially means, that the terms of contract should be precise and understood in the same way. Agree upon the same thing in the same sense. I'm just repeating it. And yeah, so basically this is what it is. The terms of contract should be precise and they should be understood in the same way by both parties. Okay, so let's look at I've told you to look at certain other sections. Okay, so let's look at section 9. All right, let's look at section 9. So other important aspects of contract. Should we see it here? What happened? Why is everybody getting restless? We are just looking at certain other aspects of contract law, okay, which are there in the Contract Act. We want to make sure we understand the definitions. Okay, some people have this. Okay, there's a misconception among many people that contracts have to be written. They don't have to be written. Why? If somebody argues with you, you point them to section 9. Okay, what does section 9 say? Can you see? Determine for yourself that there is no need for contracts to be written by reading section 9. Can you satisfy yourself? No, don't confuse the two things. The point, proof is a separate matter. This is like our current controversy with CAA and NRC. Most of the people who are jumping up and down, they are actually saying, how will NRC be done? So there are two separate issues completely. Okay, you can have CAA without NRC, you can have NRC without CAA. Those are, when you're having the discussion, they should be very clear that there are two separate issues. So this is the natural confusion I can understand. So proof will come to later. First understand what is this, how to prove something, that we'll worry about later. Okay, so here for instance, first let's make this very clear. Let's understand section 9 very clearly. Okay, it talks about promises express and implied. Why are promises important? Because reciprocal promises will form an agreement. Remember? Yes. So reciprocal promises will form an agreement, and as we will see very soon in section 10, if that agreement can pass through all the filters of section 10, it will become a contract. It will be deemed to be a contract. This is clear? Okay. So if that agreement, so therefore we have to be very clear about what kind of promises are recognized in contract law. Promises can be both express and implied. Okay. What is an express promise? Words. Promise is made in words. Okay, that is an express. Now, if I say promises made in words are express promises, does that mean that it has to be written words? Because I didn't say written words. Does this act say written words? No. Spoken words are also words. Okay, so this is very clear that therefore, first thing is that there is no need for a contract to be written. Okay, it can also be a a verbal contract, right? I can contract with a gardener saying that you come and do my garden once a week, and at the end of the month I'll pay you 10,000 rupees. Okay, there's no writing anywhere, but that is if somehow we can establish that this kind of communication took place. How we will establish proof, don't worry about that at the moment. That is a separate question. Okay, that is dealt with the Evidence Act and Code of Civil Procedure, Criminal Procedure, but treat that as a separate question. First is assume that God is watching, or somehow we can determine that this conversation took place. If we can determine that it took place, then it is a valid agreement. Okay, it is enforceable. Yes. So we had you had a question earlier. We'll come to we'll look. No, sorry, Kamya had a question first. Yeah.
So the other party can deny
Yeah. So you are again dealing with the same question that Munira raised, which is proof. How will you prove? You are focusing. So I am telling you now, your training, even for your CAA NRC discussions, please be clear. You can have any view on it, but there is no question of any view on this. They are two separate issues. The proof also is a separate issue. First, understand in the eyes of law what is a valid contract. Now, how you will prove it? Now, Kamya is also focusing. It is natural. I'm not blaming you for thinking about it. Both Munira and Kamya have focused on the same point. That how will we prove the other party can deny? That is a separate issue. How you will prove it is a separate issue. Don't get confused with this and that. First, understand what is substantively the position in law. Okay, how to prove it? That you sometimes it may happen that you will not be able to prove it, but there are many ways to prove. Okay, proof. So just like when people are jumping up and down about how there are procedure of implementing certain measures can be changed. It's not just one procedure is going to remain forever. You can make improvements everywhere. So those don't worry about the proof. There are many ways to prove. So proof is a separate matter. Okay, is this clear? So for a moment you worry about proof, later treat it as a separate matter. Understand substantively what the position in law is. It is an express promise made in words, no qualification of words. It does not say written words. The word words has not been qualified by adding adjectives like written words, spoken words, which means therefore it applies to all types. Okay, please understand the language. I discussed it earlier with didn't I discuss it with respect to the contracts, that it is applicable to both parties. If you say enforceable by law, you have not qualified it. That means it is enforceable against the widest range of parties possible who are party to the contract. Okay, so in this case also promise is made in words. The word words has not been qualified. That means it includes spoken words, written words, everything. Yeah.
So why can't you call it like avoidance?
No, because what we are saying right now, we are not even at the stage of agreement. We are just saying what is the promise, what kind of promises will we consider under the in contract law, what kind of promises are considered valid. Okay, so then you have to see whether there's a reciprocal promise. If I make you a promise later on, like I gave the example in the other class, that I will give somebody my laptop, I will give I make a promise. Let's say we have discussed nudum pactum in the previous class. Didn't we discuss it? Bare promise. So I promised Narula that when after 6 months I'll give him my laptop. Okay, so the question is, this will be a promise, but this is not an agreement. That is enforceable by law, because this is a nudum pactum, because he is not required to do anything. So at this stage we are trying to understand only what kind of promises will be considered valid. So here in section 9, the act is only clarifying what kind of promises the law will recognize.
So how will the spoken contract will be enforced by law?
That again you are coming back to the point of proof. That we will worry about. That we will worry about later.
Is that one specific thing that enforces the law, enforces the contract?
No. See, if there is a spoken promise, okay, and if there are it has to jump through all the hoops of section 10, which we haven't come to yet. But if there is a spoken promise, and assuming that all the other tests are satisfied, if you can somehow establish that there was a spoken promise, okay, and there is a set of reciprocal promises. Remember, what is an agreement? Set of reciprocal promises. Agreement is a set of reciprocal promises. Yes. Okay, so if an agreement, if you can establish that the set of reciprocal promises forming the consideration, because set of promises forming the consideration for each other, those are reciprocal promises, and if all the other tests are satisfied, it will be an enforceable agreement. That means it will be a contract. So at this stage, don't worry about all that. At this stage, what we are trying to show you is that under section 9, okay, under section, yeah.
So if I got that conversation, the person, for example, the person is asking his guardian that I will pay you 10,000 rupees
Yeah.
for my loss. So if I record that transaction, then it is enforceable.
No. 1 minute. The recording, 1 minute. I have to again now deduct marks for Shubham and Kamya, because you're carrying on you're conducting your own conference at the back. Now, okay, once again, what Mehul is also asking is all about how to prove. So at this stage, there is it's a very natural question which all three of them have asked. It is very natural to think about that. How am I going to prove it? But I'm telling you once again, and use the CIA and RCA also, use it, practice on CA and RCA also. Those are two separate issues. The CA is a substantive law, this is a procedural aspect, okay? So how to enforce, you worry about later. Understand what is recognized by the law, okay? How you will establish that there was that's a separate issue. So at this point, you just follow my instructions. Don't confuse the two issues. How to establish that we will worry about later. First, you assume that God is watching, and if you can establish that this is what the law will recognize, okay? Remember one thing, if the law had said this, see, if the law had said that only written words are accepted, that's not what the contract law says in India, okay? It says words only, it does not say written words. So if the law had said only written words are accepted, then even if, let's say, when you are getting married, what is happening, okay? In front of so many people, you are getting married, so each is making promises to the other, right? But if you don't sign a marriage certificate as such, okay, there is no written record. All that happened is hundreds of people have seen you in front of them making promises to each other. Those are reciprocal promises. Are you following? Okay, especially if you look at under Muslim law, marriage is clearly treated as a contract. So if the husband and wife make promises to each other, then the contract is complete and the marriage is perfect. Okay, so there's nothing written there. But if the law had written, assuming that marriage comes under the law of contract, okay, and if the law had written that, if the legislature had drafted it in this way, that they had written the word, they had put the words written in here, then no, 1 minute, understand this. Everybody else should also understand this. There's a massive casualty. After lunch, almost 80% of the class is sleeping. But anyway, I don't want to say anything. But that's okay, because sleeping is a allowed activity. Okay. So 1 minute. Okay. So understand this, what we are trying to show you here, 1 minute, these are legitimate questions, but let's understand this. If the legislature had drafted section 9 in such a way that before words, there was a qualifier, written words. Okay, 1 minute, let me finish the answer, okay. If the legislature had written this, okay, had drafted it this way, that this was written words, not just made in words, but made in written words, this would have meant that no verbal agreement would be enforceable, even if you can prove it. Like an example of a marriage where in front of hundreds of people the husband and wife make promises to each other, right, which they're supposed to be bound by. Yeah, you can go now. I hope you don't miss your train. Okay, okay, welcome. Okay, so remember, this can only be done by one person in any given class. And it's a facility that should not be abused, okay? So you are responsible students, you should not abuse this facility. Okay. All right, where was I? Here. All right, okay. So let's be very clear. I'm coming to you, Jakar, 1 sec. Let's be very clear. If the legislature had drafted section 9 in such a way that before words, there was written words, okay, then you would have had a problem enforcing even a verbal agreement which is witnessed by hundreds of people, because they can then testify that yes, I saw them exchanging wedding vows. Yes, So normally they would be bound by that contract. So even if you can prove it, you can't enforce it because the law doesn't recognize anything which is not written. Is this clear? So understand the difference between proof, how to prove something, and what the substantive law recognizes. Okay, so if you see, there's a definition in unit 1 of what is the difference between substantive laws and procedural laws. Okay, substantive laws will essentially, what is the meaning of substantive? It defines the rights and liabilities of the parties, okay, of the people affected by the law. All right, so here what the Contract Act is doing is, in some sense, it is defining the rights, which means even if you have a contract, if you have an agreement, if there was a promise, if there was a promise made in words, does not have to be written words. If it was a promise made in words, the law will recognize it, okay, as a valid promise. Now, as to how you prove that there was a thing, that is a separate question. That is covered by the Evidence Act and what kind of evidence is admissible and all that. So that's a separate question. So when we are talking about understanding what the law recognizes, we assume that it can be proved. This is what I'm saying to you. It may sound a little odd to you, but otherwise you'll have difficulty understanding the concept. So when you're trying to understand what the substantive law is, okay, this is what we call substantive law. It is defining rights and liabilities, okay? Just like what is CAA saying? Is saying that certain members of certain religious groups, religious minorities from certain 3 countries will have the right to claim citizenship. Okay, now how they will claim it, those questions have not been clarified yet. Okay, that is a separate matter, but at least substantive law, it is conferring certain rights on those people. Okay, so therefore this is basically what a substantive law does. So when you're trying to understand what the nature of the substantive law is, at that point you don't worry about how you're going to prove that you're entitled to this right. If you do that, then you'll get confused. Is this clear? Have you understood, Garima? Does this make sense to you? That you should not confuse the two things. Okay, so even, let's say, 1 minute, let's say a Parsi who has come from Pakistan and is trying to take advantage of CAA, and now his question may be, how do I prove that I came from Pakistan and not from Fiji and all these things? Those are separate matters. The point is that if he can prove that he came from Pakistan, that he is a Parsi, then the law will give him the right to apply for citizenship. So that we have to understand exactly what right the law is giving to who. That's what we are trying to understand here in section 9. Okay, so while trying to understand that, we should not confuse ourselves here. We have to assume that he can prove it. Okay, otherwise, and how to prove, that's a separate matter, because remember, procedures also don't remain stagnant. If you see procedure for filing income tax return, that is changing almost every year. Okay, there have been all kinds of continuous improvements, and India, we have standards on procedure also. You can't just set up any old procedure. Procedure has to be fair. Okay, there's a famous Maneka Gandhi case, okay, where her passport was seized. So there are certain guidelines in Indian constitutional law and procedure. Every procedure has to be subjected to a fairness check. So there are many ways to take care of procedure. So don't confuse the two things. So at this point, yeah, is this point clear to everybody? We are only trying to understand the substantive law. At this point, we will assume that it can be proved. Okay, and then how to prove later, that is a separate question. That does not affect the elements of the substantive law. Yeah, you still have a question? Okay, no, you can ask any question, but you should have absorbed what I told you just now. Okay, because if you don't go on to the same question, because that question is not appropriate. I mean, you have to assume that it can be proved. Okay, otherwise you'll not understand the substance. Yeah.
In section 9, there's no difference between contract and agreement.
No, section 9 is not talking about agreement also. Section 9, sorry?
In section 9, there's no difference between a contract and an agreement.
No, there is no question of till section 9. This whole thing is actually part of the Contract Act. Okay, this whole thing is, yeah. One minute, let's deal with his question first. Okay, similar question. And what is your question?
So in section 9, there is no need of contract to be written. So respectively, there is no need of agreement to be written.
No. 1 minute. Let's understand something. Okay, so this entire thing is the Contract Act. Okay, and different sections are dealing with different topics. Like chapter 1, 3 to 9 is dealing with communication, acceptance and revocation of proposals. And why is section 9 dealing with promises? Because proposals, when accepted, will What will happen to proposal when it becomes accepted? It becomes a promise. So you're not revising stuff that was taught even one day before. Proposal when accepted becomes a promise or not? What is? Let's go back to your definition.
Yes, sir. It becomes a promise.
Proposal when accepted becomes a promise, right? Look, go back to your notes. What is the promise?
Proposal when accepted becomes a promise.
Okay, right? So in this section here, they have tried to define different elements. Okay, different parts of the act deal with everything, different types of topics. Here they are talking about these topics. Here they are defining these kinds of categories. Okay, so but the whole thing is, see, there is a principle in interpretation. Quiet. I'm still hearing sounds. Be quiet. There is a principle in interpretation which goes like this, which is that the act has to be read as a whole. Okay, so there is no such thing as like it's coming up to here, or if the whole thing is part of the act. So when you are talking about what is a contract or not is not a contract, and this is a very important section. What agreements are contract? When you come to section 10, you'll understand how you move from agreement to contract. You have to pass through 5 filters, which are given in section 10. Okay, so section 9 is only talking about promises. Because why are promises important? Because the moment you have reciprocal promises and there is no other bar or disqualification, then you have a valid agreement. Because reciprocal promises means promises forming the consideration for each other. So you have consideration and you have a valid agreement. So that's why it's important to understand what kind of promises will the law recognize. Now in some countries they may have a law saying that we only recognize written promises. That is up to that country. But in our country, and this is true in England also, this comes from the English common law of contracts, our law of contract. In our country, we recognize spoken words also. How to prove that those words were spoken? That I told my gardener that if you come and do my garden every day, every week, I will pay you 10,000 rupees at the end of the month. How I told him that? How does he prove that I told him that? That's a separate matter. We assume that it can be proved. But if it can be proved, the law will not insist on a written contract. Is this point clear? First point is clear? Yes? Mahima, are you following now the answer to your question? It has to be read as a whole. Now once you see section 10, it will become a little bit clear. If it's not, then you ask the question again. Okay, yes, Jakar, what was your question?
Sir, I was asking that when you are expressing the promise by word, the words itself are unclear. Since like आप किसी बोलते हो कि
No, you speak in English. It doesn't matter if your English is wrong, you speak in English. Okay, I understand what you're saying. You're saying the words are not clear.
yes, and taking later the person, the promiser will take advantage of all the words.
Yeah, so in that case, see, that will be attacked on a different ground. See, it will not be attacked on the ground that it was, the promises were made in words, in spoken words. You're talking about spoken words, right? So that problem of, and you're saying there's going to be some problem with the contract, with the validity of the agreement, and you're saying that the words were not clear. So in that case, the ground of attack, you understand the ground of attack, you know what is meant by grounds? That I am on the basis of, very good. Grounds means on the basis of, on what basis? Okay, so I'm not allowing Pranshul, I'm not giving attendance to Pranshul on what basis, on what ground? Not because I don't like his cap, because he came after the deadline.
Sir,
Are you following? On what basis? Pranshul, right? Pranshul is the one who came? Other section, okay, yeah.
so since the contract has been made on certain assumptions,
Yeah.
and those assumptions, the two parties made by themselves. Like one person assumed the contract will be like this, and the other person assumed it to be like this. So when
You're saying the other person assumes something else. Yeah. So in that case, the problem will be the ground. Let's understand the ground. So you understand what is meant by grounds? Like, why did I not give him attendance? Okay, because he came after the. On what ground did I not give him? Because he came after the deadline. Okay. So on that, in that case, what Jakar is talking about is contract is made in spoken words, but the spoken words were not clear. One party thought he was buying a white horse, the other party thought he was selling a black elephant. Okay, that is not good. That kind of contract will not be void or unenforceable because of the fact that it was made in spoken words. It will be void on the ground of uncertainty, or basically there will be lack of what we call 1 minute. Consensus ad idem. There is no meeting of the minds. The people are not agreeing here. Look at this. Agree to the same thing in the same sense. Remember? Consensus on myths is called the meeting of the minds. So the example that Jakar is giving is that contract will be problematic, will be difficult to enforce, not because it was spoken in words, but because the people did not meet. There was no meeting of the minds. One person thinks he is buying a black elephant, other person thinks he is selling a white horse. So they did not. Are you following this logic? It's important to follow the logic. Why is that contract going to be so? On what ground will that contract be nullified? It will be nullified on the ground of lack of consensus ad idem, lack of meeting of the minds. That means, remember, in contracts it's very important that both people have agreed to the same thing, okay, in the same sense. So consent is not even there actually. If you look at section 13, you will actually say for this contract that there was no consent, because what does consent require under section 13? Agree upon the same thing. Did they agree upon the same thing here?
They assume.
They assume, but they are assuming different things, right? So they did not agree on the same thing in the same sense. They did not have this agreement. Is this clear?
Yes.
Are you following? So this agreement will fail not because it was in words. Please understand that. So section 9 still remains valid. This will be attacked on the ground of section 13. That because there was no consent, because if for consent you have to agree to the same thing in the same sense. There has to be a meeting of minds. Okay, just like when you're putting the USB thing into the slot, if you don't put it the right way, it doesn't go in smoothly, so there's no perfect match. Okay, all right, so let's go back to section 9. Okay, your time is up. I could not play you that nice. I've got a nice new alarm with a rooster alarm to wake up all the people who are sleeping. I've got you'll hear it in the next class. It's a nice rooster alarm. Okay, maybe I'll so you guys can go now. Okay, unless anybody has a technical question, then I'll ask. You have a technical question? Good. So try not to. You guys are free to go home now. You have any more classes? Okay, 1 minute. Yeah. Okay, let's go first. Let her go first. Yeah. You can go. No, ladies first. So we will process your question first. अच्छा, इसको आप ले जाइए. इसको ले जाइए. लेके आप कहाँ रखोगे? अभी आ रहा हूँ मैं. We'll come to that later. That's an administrative question. Just wait. First, I want to answer technical questions related to the topics. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, Monira, go first.
Yeah, okay, like in general, people that partnership is an agreement.
Yes.
But since partnership is bound by the law also, the agreement is not enforced by the law. Then how can partnership be agreement?
No, I didn't understand. You're correct that partnership is an agreement. So, what are you saying? Partnership is not enforced by the law.
But agreement is not enforced by the law.
No. 1 minute. Let's be very clear. What you're asking is, it's a natural confusion. Let's be very clear. We also use expressions like loan agreements. Okay. So a contract is also an agreement. So actually a loan agreement is we are not using the word agreement because that loan agreement is not enforceable. And we could use the word loan contract also. Okay. So for instance, therefore, if we just use the word loan agreement, although it is actually a contract, it's an enforceable agreement. I understand that your confusion is logical because you're wondering why are we using the word agreement when we could have said contract. Maybe it is not enforceable against both parties and that's why we're not using the word contract. That's not true. So even a loan agreement is enforceable. We just happen to call it an agreement and not a contract. But remember that a contract is also an agreement. So if you call a void agreement a contract, that's a mistake. But if you call a contract an agreement, it's not actually a mistake. It's like you have a master's degree and I say that Monira has a bachelor's degree. So I'm not saying that Monira does not have a master's degree. I am saying that she has a bachelor. Obviously you have a bachelor's also. So all I'm saying is that Monira has a bachelor's degree. So that's not wrong. Are you following? So this idea that what you're saying partnership agreement, okay, it is enforceable because partnership agreement is an agreement enforceable by law. It's just that we don't call it a partnership contract. But your point is completely logical. Technically, to avoid confusion, we should call it a partnership contract. But these things have come to us from many years of usage in business. So if you study finance later, you'll see many terms are used in the finance industry which are not technically correct. But people have got used to using it. Okay. So suppose now actually we find that we have got used to calling you Monira. Now we say that your actual name is something else. But then we start calling you some other name, then people will get confused because we have known her so long as Monira. So this is the point. Sorry?
We on the same page and avoid confusion.
Yeah. We say loan agreement, but loan agreement does not mean that it is it's not a contract. Just like I said, if we say Monira has a bachelor's degree, even though you may have a master's, that statement is not wrong. So this is clear. That's what it means. Okay. So any other question? Your question is answered. Okay. Yeah.
I didn't understand the difference between void agreement and void contract.
Okay, now can you just switch on the light, Joker? Yeah, I can't read what she said.
When you told that Ronaldo
No, first of all, you can't say you told. You have to one minute. You have to say you said. Either you say you said or you say you told us. You can't say you told. That's wrong English. Okay. Yeah. So what is the question?
actually, I didn't understand the difference between the void agreement and void contract.
No, there is no such thing as a void contract. We don't use void contract. We don't use that terminology in India. So there's only a void agreement.
Yes, sir, and sir, when you told that can contract become a void, the answer is yes. So I don't got it.
Okay, I understand why. 1 minute. Okay. So yeah, I understand. Okay. So what you're talking about is a little bit like the difference between void agreement and a contract which becomes void. Okay. So yes, the language again can be a little bit confusing, but in this case we don't call a contract which becomes void. We don't call it a void contract. We call it a contract which becomes void. Void contract is an expression we do not use in India. Okay. We either say void agreement or we say a contract which becomes void. As in this example of Ronaldo, where when he loses his legs, the contract that used to exist, which was perfectly fine, that contract is now void. It cannot be enforced, and we are never going to call it a void contract. We will say it's a contract which became void. Just void, that's it. Is this clear? Okay. Maybe if you listen to the video once again and look at the notes, it will become clearer. I'll move the notes into your folder today itself. Clear? Okay. Yeah.
Since like a contract is made for 4-5 years,
yeah,
and it is broken in between, like it is a
let's go back to the Ronaldo example. Is that good enough for you?
Sir, it is good enough for me. So, but my question is something beyond that. Like the contract was for paying 1 lakh each year for 5 years, and it was for 5 years, and it was broken in between.
Yeah.
Like on the 3rd year. So, sir, then how the person who is getting an income from the contract will present it as an income since the contract has been already void?
No, if I understood your facts correctly, what you're saying is he enters into the contract for 5 years. So the deal is every year they will pay him the salary for that year at the end of every year. Okay, let's assume at the middle of each year. Okay, now after 3 years he plays properly. After 3 years he has the accident. Okay, say late in the 3rd year he has the accident. 31st January. He may have 31st December he has the accident on the 3rd year. So now year 4 and 5 he can't play.
Yes, sir.
But year 4 and 5 salary he cannot claim. He is not entitled to. He has received salaries for 3 years.
Yes, sir, but he wants a proof to be like Ronaldo wants to give a proof that the previous 3 lakh income was generated from this contract.
That's okay. That he has proved.
Okay.
That, see, the contract will be there. The contract will be there, and why would he need to prove that the income came from this contract? What he will need to show to the tax authorities, like Messi has some problems in Spain.
Yes, sir.
Messi has some problems with the Spanish authorities, the tax authorities.
Yes, sir.
They're after him.
Yes,
So the problem there, the issue for Messi is not that which club he got his income from. The tax authorities don't care about which club paid him the money. They care about how much money you earn. Messi is probably saying, I earned 100 million, and the tax authorities are saying, no, you earned 150 million.
Okay, so they don't care how
They don't care who paid. They don't care who your employer is. All they care is, are you understating your income or understating your income? Overstating, they are very happy. They'll collect more taxes. So is this clear?
Yes.
So that's yeah. You also have a question.
Sure, just we need to
This is procedural. Yeah. Okay. We'll come about that. Yeah.
Suppose there is a contract and
Then what?
person is perfectly fine to pay or to follow the contract.
Okay.
But client decided not to follow. Then this is called breach contract.
This is a breach. This is a breach of contract. We'll come to that. This is a breach of contract. This is the example here. That does contract become void? No. It was not a voidable contract to start with. Here, it was not a voidable contract. Okay. Then, how was this? Okay, this is still there, but you can't see. Okay, it was not a voidable contract to start with. Okay. So then the question is, does it become void? The answer is no. It does not become void. So then you go into this branch. Does not become void. So it is perfectly enforceable. And then they can have two outcomes. Either people will perform the contract properly, or they will breach the contract. Then if you breach, then there are some other remedies that you can have. But that is breach. So we'll have a case on breach of contract also. Clear? Okay. Yeah. 1 minute. Let me just close the recording. So your question is not on a contract law question, right? It's an administrative question. Yes. Administrative question about the group. Yeah.